Morning all, so lovely to see you. Really good to be here. I've actually just come from a What Next meeting. I don't know how many of you know about What Next. It's a national UK-wide movement that looks at shaping and debating the future of arts and culture in the UK through conversation. And there's a sort of public conversation that anyone can join every 2 weeks on Zoom. And the one this morning was on education. So I have a head already full of education policy thinking. What was really interesting was we had presentations from colleagues in each of the devolved nations in the UK this morning. And just that breadth and difference of approach in other nations, in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland and in England, was really interesting to hear. So if you'd like to get involved with What Next or come to one of these meetings, I'll put the information in the chat below because we're always delighted when people come and join us. But I'll just start. Does everybody know who the Cultural Learning Alliance is? Sort of wave to me if you do on the Zoom, and I'll have a quick sort of, probably about half, so I'll do a very speedy overview of who we are. So my name is Lizzie Crump. I'm the co-director of the Cultural Learning Alliance. You may have come across my fantastic co-director Sam Carnes, who works with me. And the Cultural Learning Alliance has been going for about 10 years now, and we are a sort of project. We're a small initiative at core, but large in membership. There's about 10,000 members of the Cultural Learning Alliance who all believe every child and young person should have access to high quality, equitable arts and culture in their lives. And we do this by working with government, working with the sector, lobbying. We do a lot of work. I often say I should have a t-shirt that says reading white papers so you don't have to. We do a lot of work sifting through those dense pieces of information to try and find out what that policy landscape for arts and culture and education is, and enable different voices to be heard in government and in that policy making process. So when I was asked to think about education policy, I was thought I might start by pointing out on our website, I'm going to put it in the links in a minute, there's a document which takes us through 20 years of policy change for arts and cultural education, chiefly in England, which is a really good starting guide to some of the policy conversations that we've had and have happened. And it sort of starts in 1999 when the National Advisory Committee on Creative and Cultural Education authored All Our Futures, which is still a document that some of you may still have on your shelves. Penny, I'm looking at your shelves behind you and wondering if you've got one there. You can wave. But yeah, it's still a document that is used today, and it was authored by a commission with Sir Ken Robinson. And interestingly, this was a document that put creativity at the sort of heart. She does have what I knew you would, Penny. This is a document that puts sort of creativity at the heart of policy making and looks at sort of empowering children and young people and their creative selves, their creative patches, their creative understanding and their competencies, and threading that as the core of education. Now, it's interesting because it was a document that both the DCMS and the DFE were part of that sort of commissioning and development process. And because of that, some of the recommendations from that report came into reality. So we saw such things as the sort of immediate development of youth music, which is a huge charity that has been supported by the government through the Arts Council ever since in terms of young people's music making. We also saw sort of the beginnings of that investment into the Creative Partnerships scheme, where schools were given funding through the Arts Council and various organisations to look at developing creativity in partnership with arts organisations and creative professionals and their children and young people. We've seen things like the development of the Arts Council's Arts Mark programme, which happened sort of in the early 2000s, where lots of you will be aware that that still exists, and that's that excellent auditing tool that gives schools a framework to be looking at the quality of the arts and culture that they offer to their children and young people. And interestingly, I think that framework is being looked at the moment to give more focus and agency on young people's personal creativity creativity. I heard our great director of children and young people at the Arts Council the other day saying, what's the mark that the arts leaves on that child and on that school, and how do we evaluate that and value it and think about the young person's mark that they make on the world? So that scheme's there. It helps, it can help schools to think about the offer that they have. We've seen all sorts of sort of a gallop through that sort of 20 years. We've seen sort of a focus on the arts and a focus on creativity as a bit of a seesaw through that 20-year timeline. So if you look at the sort of work that All Our Futures did and the work that Ken Robinson did, was a sort of real focus on creativity in that early 2000s, was a focus on thinking about creativity in children and young people. That really seesawed, particularly when we got to sort of 2010 and that change in government, to a focus on the arts and on art subjects. And almost overnight, that language around creativity disappeared from government policy. And it's always worth checking in whenever you're doing any lobbying around arts education to read some of the rhetoric on the DfE website, some of the rhetoric from government, to see where they are on that spectrum. So I would say on that spectrum, so I'm just checking my timing. How am I doing, Zara? I know I always go over. On that spectrum at the moment, we have had our longest running schools minister of, I think it's of all time, which is Nick Gibb, who has been in post as our schools minister for a decade now and has sort of really had a role in shaping that education policy. So I would say from our point of view at the CLA, that has been an absolutely sort of fundamental focus on arts and not on creativity. So we've seen sort of a rhetoric that's centered around art subjects. We saw a revision of our national curriculum, which has a sort of focus and a purpose of education being that which has been thought and written. So I'll just let that sit, particularly for our dance audience. That's been thought and written. Is a very specific thing. It obviously doesn't look at children's personal agency and creativity in that purpose of education in the national curriculum. It doesn't include a lot of the things that we would think about. It talks about an appreciation of human creativity, but it doesn't talk about the creativity itself. A lot of what we hear from government at the moment is focused on that sort of arts subject teaching. And one of the things that we lobby for in terms of the CLA is making sure that there's absolute equity when we lobby. What we want is for art subjects to be part of that broad and balanced curriculum. And that's a key phrase in the education landscape at the moment, as most of you will know. That broad and balanced curriculum must include high quality arts and cultural subjects. And that's something that we're constantly lobbying for. We want them to be given the same parity and status of other subjects. Sometimes that rhetoric from government, we hear a lot about STEM, we hear a lot about languages, we hear a lot about maths and English. We're saying that broad and balanced curriculum, it's essential that it is broad, it does include the arts, and that's really important. One of the really useful tools we've got for doing that is that Ofsted are going into schools and wanting to see that broad and balanced curriculum. And colleagues will know that Ofsted look at cultural capital, which I'm just checking if you've all come across that term. Yes, lots of nodding. There's a very useful blog on the CLA website, which I will pop up after I've done this little talk, which my colleague Sam wrote, which sort of explains the origin of the term cultural capital, what it can mean and what it could be. It's problematic in that it is tied to that some DfE purpose of education, that's introducing young people to the best that's been thought and read. But interestingly, we have found that many schools and cultural organisations that have worked with them have been able to use the very existence of the phrase cultural capital to open up a dialogue about the arts and culture and open up sort of thinking and provision for children and young people, which is broader than that definition in the national curriculum. So even though it's in itself quite narrow, it can have quite a big impact. Now, Ofsted itself often has an impact in the kind of learning that schools are able to offer. there's a particular thing that they do at the moment, which again, I'm looking across my Zoom screen, which is called a deep dive, where they pick a subject in a school and they do a deep dive to look and see what that provision is and the quality of that provision. They do a lot of work. And although this is really stressful for teachers when it happens to them, it's one of those things which is actually an interesting source of data about what's happening with schools. When they go in to look at art subjects, we're able to see sort of the findings of those deep dives. Some of them are being published by Ofsted now, and we can see sort of snapshots of what's happening for those subjects in schools. But also it's a good lever if we're talking about going into schools and doing advocacy. It's a good lever to go in and support those subject specialist teachers and say, if Ofsted come in and do a deep dive, we can help you get match fit for that. We as arts and cultural colleagues can come in and work with you on that curriculum and provision and think about how that's delivered. So there are things within that are useful, though I'm not in any way, for the teachers in the room, discounting how stressful and complex that is if it is you that Ofsted come in to choose. So I'm just looking again at my 20-year timeline, and obviously there's all sorts within this, including the introduction of the English Baccalaureate that came in around the 2010s with Nick Gibb. So colleagues will know that English Baccalaureate looks to try and encourage secondary school pupils to study a sort of core set of subjects in schools, and that doesn't include the arts. So it uses a range of different accountability measures to sort of weight and incentivize students to choose some of those subjects. And this is actually an argument that we have had with the DfE and with Nick Gibb and with all sorts of our sort of varying carousel of Education Secretary of States over that last 10 years. But I mention it now because when I was chatting to Zara and Claire about the sort of design of this particular element of what we're talking about, this particular policy is fading away, I think. It's there in advocacy, but it's not something that's front and centre of head teachers' minds. And colleagues might find it different. I'd be really interested to hear if you found differently. But in the CLA, we found that head teachers are striving to ignore it. And if head teachers are striving to ignore it and the DfE aren't pushing it, what we're finding in the CLA is we wouldn't start a conversation lobbying or advocating around the EVAT, because at the moment, that's not where the policy levers are for the DfE in order to make change. So what we try and do is look at sort of those areas of policy development where there's change that can be made and we can make the biggest difference in terms of children and young people's minds, children and people's lives, and the biggest difference to that cohort of teachers and artists and organisations, and look at where we can sort of shape our narrative, which always remains the same, about that power of children and young people, and is based, I should say, on extensive work on evidence. We try extremely hard to ensure we never overclaim at the CLA. We've got an evidence bank of green booked evidence, which means sort of government level evidence that you know is absolutely compelling in terms of the role of arts and culture in children and people's lives. And I'll look at that. I'll put that in the chat so you can have a look at it afterwards. So yes, when we're doing that national advocacy, we look at what some of those live issues are where we can advocate. And at the moment, can I just have a quick time check, Zara? How am I doing?
So you've got about 4 minutes left.
Great. So at the moment, those key things are obviously the recovery work that's happening in terms of the government. So there's all sorts of politics about the narrative that government and others are using about some of that recovery from the pandemic. And I would argue, as I have done for the last 3 months, we're not out of that pandemic at the moment. We may be transitioning through it, but we're still very much in it, and many of our colleagues in arts and culture and in schools are not operating in anything like the kind of context or that they were sort of 2 years ago. And so I feel sometimes in our cultural sector we're champing at the bit to be open and to be in a place where we've moved on, and I don't think we're in that place yet. So that point of recovery is the moment, I think, at the moment where we can have some policy conversations with our colleagues in education and think about how we can help and support them through and with arts and culture. So many of you will be already thinking about, and we had this discussion, I think, in the last one of these that I came to, about that summer provision and about thinking about how some of that schools and activity fund, that healthy food and activity fund can be used. It goes directly to local authorities, that funding, and how that can be used for some arts provision. We know that there's funding for summer schools for transition, particularly for kids going to year 6 to year 7, that the government has released, and that funding can be used for arts and cultural provision too. And that's a conversation that colleagues can be having directly with schools about how they can help to deliver that. But I think it's interesting to think about that recovery premium that's gone directly to schools. I think it's about £300 million that was initially sort of released for that. And schools can choose how they look at that recovery premium. And one of the things we've been saying at the CLA is back to that broad and balanced curriculum argument, just making absolutely sure and crystal clear that those art subjects need investment too. So there's a lot of sort of narrative sort of saying, oh, we must make sure that we're sort of running catch up for maths and English. We want that funding to be used for high quality arts and cultural provision. Some kids have absolutely thrived at home, working in their bedrooms on their art projects, creating music, talking on Zoom, using their digital work. Others have really struggled, particularly kids that don't have access to that digital infrastructure, don't have access to those musical instruments, don't have access to those art materials. And we feel that if there is a narrative around catch up and recovery, it's really important that that includes art subjects too. But there's that broader use of that recovery premium. And I think we can have a discussion, and we are having discussions at sort of national level and local level about whether there are ways to start thinking about different ways of delivering education as part of that recovery narrative, thinking about resilience, thinking about mental health, thinking about bringing all of those things that are within a school's remit a little more to the surface, and thinking about how arts and culture can play a part in looking at that. How am I doing in terms of time, Zara?
About 30 seconds.
Okay, so in my last 30 seconds, I'm gonna mention two things. So two sort of supporting things that it's really worth being aware of. Our Arts Council England has a delivery plan that it's just published the headlines of, and it's called Let's Create, and it has ambitions for children and young people running all the way through it. And those ambitions include, all of those things that we would want to see working with youth services, working with local authorities, working with families, working with young people themselves. There's a focus on early years in there. It's a really useful document to have a look at. And the second thing I'll say in my last 15 seconds is that the Durham Commission, which I don't know if colleagues are aware of, it was a commission that was set up by Durham University, published, I think it was about a year ago, a document that set out 10 recommendations of things that it wanted to achieve in terms of children's creativity. They have just published a sort of post-COVID revision of that document, which includes 6 recommendations within that of things that they think are going to be achievable and even more necessary in the post-COVID landscape. And I would recommend colleagues have a look at that as well. There is an opportunity via schools for schools to apply for funding to be a creativity collaborative that went live last Thursday, that it's definitely worth colleagues having a look at. So that's my 15-minute 20-year gallop through arts education policy. I've missed out hundreds of things, but I'm very happy to take any questions from anyone in the group. I can see that there are some in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. What a fascinating and energizing insight. Thank you so much, Lizzie. Really appreciate that. And thank you so much for reading all those white papers so that we don't have to, and reminding us, the stark reminder of the power of the Cultural Learning Alliance. 10,000 members. That's quite an army of supporters, and the power of that when it comes to advocacy and influencing national policy must be really powerful. So thank you. We do have some comments and questions, and we've got about 8 minutes for questions. So if you do want to ask Lizzie a question, please do pop it in the chat and we'll come to you. But I'm going to go to Jeremy first. Jeremy, would you like to unmute yourself and share your comment about the deep dive?
Yeah, it's just I work for a local authority in a school improvement team, so we've done quite a lot over the last couple of years of supporting schools get ready for deep dives, and we help to do quite a lot of myth busting. What we found is that Ofsted inspection teams are coming in and asking schools to nominate the subjects. It's not Ofsted doing it at schools. So, and one of the questions that we see that seems to be quite common is, tell us your best subject, tell us your subject that needs the most development. We'll look at those. Primary schools are being looked at around about 4 subjects. So it's maths and English plus 2 others. In high schools, it's sometimes up to 8, but it's usually around about 6 subjects that we've seen in our schools and our neighbours, and that's again, it's maths and English, and then a range of 4 subjects, mostly including science in one of those other 4. And it's just, but it's interesting that they're doing those negotiations around those subjects. The other thing that Ofsted have said is that over time there will be a balance, and there's you probably find that a lot of local authorities have done some work that it may make sense for you as a cultural organisation, if you're not either a school or connected, would benefit from actually connecting to, finding out what's going on, finding out what support's there. We've also, as an LSEP, done quite a lot of work at actually looking at the curriculum content, and Yvonne, who's on this call, has done a lot of work with our primary schools, looking at what a really vibrant arts curriculum looks like, and actually going and doing that. It's been a bit of a money spinner for us, but it's also been a really good way of helping schools think about high quality art and get it embedded into their curriculum offer.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing that. We have a flurry of questions here for you, Lizzie. So Penny, can we come to you next?
Yeah, so I'm very lucky because I work with Lizzie a lot, and you're one of my heroes, definitely. Big fan of What Next and CLA. I'm sorry that I couldn't come to the meeting. I had a mentoring session. So Lizzie, you know we've had a conversation with Kate Robinson about, so for those of you that don't know, Ken Robinson was our patron for 20 years, which is why I've got all our futures next to me. And Kate's convening a panel, some of the existing panel for all our futures and some new people. And I'm sure you'll be on it, Lizzie, if you haven't been told already, asked already. But I think also that there was mention at the APPG for Art, Craft and Design, that which is where I met Jen Gibb actually, that there's going to be a new cultural education plan. And Sally Bacon probably knows about that as well. So would you just expand on that? Because I'm slightly confused about the relationship between that and the Let's Create delivery plan and how it fits into creative collaboratives, etc.
So no one has as yet confirmed that a cultural education plan is in the offing. However, it's a recommendation of Durham. It's one of Durham's recommendations. It's a core recommendation of the Cultural Learning Alliance. We think the government should write one. And this is where, when I sort of started my discussion, having the DFE and the DCMS agree and sign up to a plan like this is one of those reasons why those kind of documents stop just being policy documents and start enacting sort of investment and initiatives and change. So we are always pushing for both of those departments of the government to work together with colleagues to make that happen. So we've been advocating to the DFE to do it. It would be wonderful if they took that recommendation from Durham, or that recommendation from the CLA, or from others. Arts Council actually made that recommendation to the DFE this morning in the What Next meeting, for that to happen. I think what Kate's doing is probably going to be more of a standalone document, looking at sort of that, rethinking it and revisiting, but it would make absolute sense for those 2 bits of thinking to come together. There are also a number of other sort of commissions or bits of future thinking around cultural education that are happening at the moment. Colleagues might have seen that the Times newspaper has set up a Times Educational Commission into the future of education, which has got about 20 sort of individuals, generally pretty high profile across the country, who are coming together to have that conversation. There's also the Edge Foundation, who are leading a conversation about rethinking assessment at the moment, which is a really interesting one that again I'll put the link in the chat. So I think what I would say is this is a really interesting moment post-pandemic, where everybody is sort of recognizing a real need for change, and you know, lots of different people are starting to come together and coalesce to think about what that future of education might be. So for us at the Cultural Learning Alliance, what we're sort of saying is we want arts and cultural education and high quality equitable arts and cultural education to be, you know, at the heart of all of those conversations. So we're working to ensure that that's one of the things that we do. But it would be really interesting to see in sort of a year's time what each of those sort of commissions and thinkers come up with, and how we can work together to pull them into one. Does that make sense, Penny?
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm unmute. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Lizzie. And it's great that you, because I know that you've been awarded loads of awards, but you really are such a strong advocate. It's brilliant. We need you, Lizzie, and Sam.
You're here. Big shout out for Lizzie. We've got a question from Sheila, but I think that's been answered because somebody has helpfully put in a link. Lizzie, you've put in a link to the Creativity Collaborative funding, but there is another linked question here from Roysha. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question about how you think this fits?
Well, it could fit if you have a lead school in your cultural education partnership who could make the application.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Roysha, we've got a bit of a glitch.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah, shall we, we've got your questions, so should we just ask Lizzie to respond? Would that be okay? Yeah, I think Roysha's frozen. So Lizzie, if you want to continue.
Yeah, I think you can fit if you've got a lead school. So it's a lot of money. I think there's not going to be loads of them, but it's up to £360,000 between October 2021 and July 2024, so over a 3-year time period. But to be eligible, you have to be a state-maintained schools of any phase who lead teaching for creativity work with an existing network, or a potential to build one of 8 to 12 schools. So it would be useful to a CEP if you've got that kind of network or wanted to build that kind of network of schools through this process, but you would need a school to be your lead in terms of making the application for the funding through the Arts Council website. Does that make sense?
That's really clear. Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. And we've got time for one more question. Sheila, this is a really interesting question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi there, Lizzie, thank you. My question was about what impact you think the bridge organisations have had over the last decade, and how you see that. Will they exist in the future? Will they survive in the future? Thank you.
I'm actually really pro bridge organisations. I think that, you know, a lot of arts education work is about people, and it's about people's relationships and sort of understanding it. And this is the buzzword of the moment, the hyperlocal. The hyperlocal is about people and people's understanding relationships of their communities and who they work with, and the brokerage work that is needed to bring people together and facilitate that kind of conversation and relationship, I think is one of the absolutely essential things about arts education, which is why I think you know, the work that you all do, the LSEPs, is essential in that space. And I think is something that, you know, as we've seen that real sort of decimation of local authorities authorities and to our local authority colleagues. Great to hear from one earlier, by the way, Jeremy. But yeah, a real decimation of that expertise that was in local authorities sort of 10, 15 years ago has made it much more difficult for that sort of relationship culture to thrive. And so I think the bridge organisations have been amazing in that space, in understanding arts and cultural education provision in their area, bringing people together, looking at training, looking at development. But what I always have said to policymakers about this is there's only 10 of them. And so whenever colleagues are sort of saying, oh, well, schools can just go to bridge organisations to, do that work, the sheer volume of schools in the UK for those 10 organisations, it would be absolutely impossible for them to deliver across that space. And then, of course, you've got sort of that other layer of your music hubs that are sitting in that space too, which often have a different footprint and are working with different colleagues, but often the same individuals and the same schools. So, I mean, when we're talking about advocating for a national plan for cultural education, one of the reasons that we're advocating for that is to look at that brokerage and that provision and think about where it needs strengthening, because I think it does need strengthening and it does need more support in order for us to thrive, but also to put in the layer of the cultural education partnerships and make sure that that ecology is working as well as it possibly can do and is being supported in different ways. So for me, if I was going to wave a wand for a national cultural education plan, that's what I would want to see it doing. But yeah, the bridge colleagues that I've worked with are all, hugely inspirational and have done some really fantastic things, I think. And, I've just been talking to Derry Burden about the work that they've done over lockdown, particularly in getting funding out to our freelance cultural education colleagues, enabling them to work in that time period when that has, as we all know, been a huge impact and a huge problem for so many of our colleagues who haven't been able to access any funding from the government support schemes for the work that they've been able to do. So yes, a bit of a roundabout answer, but hopefully, Sheila, that answers your question.